Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, we're going to be going through the top 3 units for each of the factions in Star Wars Legion. So, for those of you who've been following the channel over the last couple of weeks, I've put out a few polls and things with what I thought were the top 3 units for each of the different factions, and people voted and things like that. I'll try and flash up the polls as we go through for each of the factions, just so you can see basically how people voted on each one. There's not going to be any particular order. I think it might be vaguely alphabetical, but I'll go through one faction at a time and talk about the sort of top 3 units for each of them. So to get right into it, we've got the first faction here, which is going to be the Separatists, so CIS, and first unit we're going to talk about is the Snail Tank, the Persuader class tank droid. You can see its unit cards there on the bottom right. I'm not going to talk through all the facets of the unit cards and things like that because it'll probably take too long, but go through sort of the main plus points of each of the units and why I think they are sort of the strongest in each of their factions. So for the Snail Tank, it'd start off with our Armor 5 continues to be really strong. It's, I think, to be fair to AMG with their playtesting, I think they got this about right. I think all the units that have Armor 5 feel pretty balanced on the whole, and I think basically you either need obviously you need that big dice pool to get over the top, or you need the keywords to get through it. So either like a Sleeper Cell or Bistan Pathfinders, for instance, in Rebels. But for the Persuader class, the Snail Tank, the 11 health is pretty strong. You can also put the defensive protocols on it, which just is incredibly frustrating to play into. So for anybody who doesn't know, it gives you outmaneuver and nimble and AI dodge. So basically normally you'd be giving this unit an order, so you wouldn't be getting that AI dodge, but you can normally share a dodge across from a super attacker, Kalani or whatever. So then it basically is dodging crits and removing. So after you've got through its armor, you're basically always removing that one extra one. I will say once you are through its dice, through its armor and past that nimble dodge, it does crumble quite quickly. Those white saves do fall down faster than you might hope, but it is just incredibly frustrating when maybe, you know, you've thrown, it's maybe got 1 or 2 health left and you're just hoping for a lucky crit from a core unit, but you need multiple lucky crits to get through. It is just really strong and yeah, more psychological perhaps than anything else. Arsenal 3 got a whole lot better in the new version of the rules. Basically with those small dice pools, it's suddenly so much easier to go through cover. And you know, the keywords continue to be as relevant as they ever were. You can combine them all together to make one huge attack if maybe you're going for armor, or you can just look to plink off, hand out suppression to multiple different units and maybe try and just do a little bit of sort of plink damage rather than focusing entirely on one unit. So that feels really strong and gives you some really nice versatile options. The direct trooper core unit is just also super good, like starting off that order chain on those B1s if you've got them or whatever, or, you know, dropping an order on some B2s that, you know, you transported last turn or something like that. Like, obviously, sorry, this version can't transport, but the other version can. Yeah, and the weak point one sides isn't that relevant, to be honest. Like with Armor 5, like maybe if they have a smaller dice pool and they can get, you know, 1 extra crit through or something, it can sometimes add up. I will say the sides on this are huge, so normally they will probably be getting that extra impact, but probably not going to make the difference between this unit sort of living and dying. Despite the fact it's only speed 1, because it is so long, you can move pretty quickly, and it's got reposition and it's a ground vehicle, so it gives you so many options in terms of maneuvering. And while the weapons do tend to be, I think they're all fixed front, it still works absolutely fine, and you can normally get your front pointing wherever you need it to be. And yeah, as I put here, similarly with the EXD rules, like those surges to give the extra black and white dice, or even the extra speed if you need it, things like that, like it is just really useful, and it is a unit that can afford to sit out in the open and have those buffs put on it by a unit that's sitting further back. In terms of how I would probably spec this, I'm thinking more about EXD here than perhaps the version that you can put into the sort of the normal list. But personally, in terms of the armament options I would take armor piercing and high energy. I think the bunker buster shells are okay, but they're a bit less relevant now that cover isn't as good, and they are only range 2. I think things that can hit at range 3 and range 4 continue to be significantly more relevant. And, getting that critical 1 on a unit that doesn't naturally surge is super helpful. So, yeah, that is really nice. In terms of the protocols, it depends how aggressive you want to be. As I think I've voiced already, the outmaneuver plus nimble combo is pretty brutal, so defensive is good. But also getting precise 2 on a unit that's going to be shooting with pretty large dice pools is really nice, so attack protocols are fine. I wouldn't go for engagement unless I was really tight for points. And then normally I'd put link targeting array on it just because you do hand out a bunch of orders in Separatists, so putting an order on this feels pretty doable, and when it is directing and things like that anyway, it feels really good. So yeah, I think chucking an order and a name on this feels really nice, and that brings it in at about 160 points, which feels absolutely fine, I think. And it can definitely be like, you can run 2 of these if you want to, there's nothing wrong with that, and it is something that is just going to control the sort of space in the battlefield really well. So yeah, a really strong unit there for the Separatists. Moving on to their next one. It is going to be Count Dooku. I think he actually won the survey for this one. The poll for this one. And I think there will be a pattern here of like the sort of more traditionally powerful units maybe slightly overperforming. I was hoping the value for points thing would come in a little bit more, but even though Dooku is quite expensive, I think he definitely does have a lot of power. So yeah, he did win with half of the vote on this one. So yeah, he has inbuilt surge to defend, which is just wild, like on a unit that's immune pierce. Yeah, he is so difficult to kill, especially as a lot of the time he'll be in melee, and it just makes him a bit harder to shoot. He is a little bit limited in terms of mobility, so there's no jump and there's no charge, so that does sort of tone him down a little bit, but yeah, it's very difficult to get through. Direct Trooper, my goodness, like because he can direct himself, like it's such a good keyword. It on his card, it maybe isn't something that like it looks super flashy, but in terms of an effect, like if all Force users could do this, if all Force users could give themselves an order, my goodness, like it's crazy. It's so strong. And if you don't want to give him an order, if he's already getting one from a card, chuck it on someone else. If you're running in with Ventress, if you want to start that B1 chain, like it's great. Really strong. He's got Master of the Force 2, and he's got 3 Force slots. I'll talk more about his sort of the way I'd run him at the end, but yeah, it gives you so many options, and that command slot's nice as well. You probably wouldn't take aggressive tactics, but even like improv or something is normally a pretty good take, although not that you need it so much in Separatists as you do in Rebels. Makashi, great, like being able to pierce 1 on a very consistent dice pool against units that are normally immune pierce and may not be getting those surges on those red saves if you're thinking about Force users. Yeah, just really good, really strong. And in combination with his command cards, you can just wipe Force users in a turn if you get a little bit lucky. His Force Lightning, like, used to be a bit of a meme and is now just great, like with the way cover works, and it's like surging to crit naturally. It's got scatter, it's got suppressive, it does so many things so well, and it's range 2. It is a little bit tricky on Dooku because you don't really want him to be hanging around at that range 2 particularly, but especially on his 1-pip turn when he's getting that Relentless and when he's got that, Arsenal 2 so he can saber somebody and lightning, feels really good. So yeah, a really nice little buff that got. And I've already mentioned Ventress. They have some nice command cards together, and they do seem to complement each other fairly well. She's a bit cheaper. He's a bit more of like a battlefield commander. You can like send her in as the homing missile, and then Dooku can come in and clean up anything that's left. So yeah, if I was to run Dooku, I think you need push. I think you reach a certain points level with a Force user where it becomes like not an auto take, but it becomes a lot more logical to take Force push. So I would do that. I'd also run Burst of Speed just for that 1-pip turn, and then there's a little bit more flex on the final ones. There's arguments for Force Choke. It's a little bit expensive and it's not as good as it used to be, but it can still definitely have some value, and especially if you can hit like some red saves, some arcs, some commandos or something, could be really useful. Reflexes maybe, and then if you're really stuck, like saber throw perhaps, but I don't think saber throw is necessary on Dooku. So yeah, and then as I've said in his command slot, probably improv, but given he surges both ways already, but aggressive tactics could be nice as well. Maybe if you've got a unit at the back with exemplar or something that could benefit from getting those surge tokens. Moving on to the final one of these, it's the humble Droideka. I thought they were 70 points, and I thought they were really good, and they're 60 points, which just wild. Like these, the ATRTs and the Aquas, like so many good, valuable units that can't be suppressed, and that's the strength of the Droideka for me. I think they might shoot once or twice a game if you're lucky, but if nothing else, if you take 3 of these and you stick them just in front of an objective to block line of sight, I don't really know what your opponent's supposed to do efficiently to get through them, unless you've got like ion or some stuff with charge or something. Like they're so difficult to deal with and they're so obnoxious, and their shields got so much better in the new version of the game. The range 3 dice pool's really consistent. Like they've got some really nice dice going on. I think you average like 3.5 hits or something. No surges, which is a bit rough. I think that's maybe something that the Droidekas would like, is maybe a surge to hit, but they don't need a buff. I'm not calling for a buff, just to be clear. Yeah, they're LOS blocking, which is great. Like it just enables you to sort of drop them in, like you can use them to protect, you know, Dooku, B2s, whatever, as they move up the board. Like just feels great. And late game, if you need them to just sprint across the board and tag an objective, they are one of the fastest units in the game at that point, similar to Taunts in that they can just zip straight across the board and be where you need them to be. You probably won't be ball moding that much because you want to hold on to those shields, but if nothing else, they still get that heavy cover when they're in wheel mode, so that works pretty well. And they don't really need like to operate with the rest of your army if you don't want them to. Like if you just want them to anchor a flank and just be a really annoying roadblock for your opponent to overcome, absolutely fantastic unit for that. Moving on to Republic, I'm not going to sort of mess around with the order here at all. I'm just going to go through the order in which they came to me. Anakin is probably still one of the best units in the game. He used to be 15 points cheaper, and that was just completely perplexing how that was allowed to happen. Don't know what was happening with the game, with the gameplay testing before he was released, but sure, whatever, we're here now. He's just 170 points, which is it's pricey. Like it puts him in that upper echelon of the sort of most expensive units in the game, and especially once you're taking force push, it starts to push him to 220, 230 points, which feels like a lot, but he can do so much. His innate master of the force is great, and 2 slots for both training and for 4 slots is great. Most of the time, I would be taking burst and push as my force upgrades, and then in the training slot, there's probably a bit more flex. You could be taking something like Tenacity if you want to. I think Into the Fray is a pretty good choice, given he doesn't naturally surge. You could also take Seize the Initiative if you think you're going to be running a bit low on orders. In terms of his mobility, he's got Jump On and Charge, so very action efficient, which is great. And I think force users without charge really tend to struggle. Obviously, like Yoda and Dooku can get them off command cards, but it does make them feel a little bit weaker. Same with Palp. Gemso and Tempted, like, is just stuff that makes it harder for your opponent to deal damage to your army, to him or to your army. And yeah, it just means that they are forced to take damage most of the time in order to deal damage to you, and that's always a real feels bad. 5 red dice, Surge Crit is fantastic. It's got some great keywords, Impact 3, PS3, so if you want to whack some armor, whack some armor. Generally, you'll be doing around 4 PS3, and if you've got an aim, it's almost 5 PS3, which is great. And that can, again, wipe squads in a turn, and it also removes the sort of variance of occasionally some defense rolls screwing you over, because like on a core squad for rebels, piercing 3 of those saves just means it's almost impossible for them to survive, right? Like they'd have to make 4 white saves on 5 white dice, which probably just isn't going to be happening. His command cards are great. Like his 1-pip has some great flexibility, whether you want to chuck him forward a bit further with that prepared positions at the start of the game, or if you want that free jump later in the game, which is fantastic. His 2-pip gives him even more damage if that's what you think he needed, and the 3-pip is just a nice consistent army buffing card. And if you want to chuck him in the 501st Battle Force, like I don't play Republic. I don't know which one is like the meta choice, as it were, but I think there's definitely advantages to having access to that 501st Battle Force, especially when it comes with the arcs. Speaking of the arcs, they got nerfed. Still really good. There's a common theme here of Republic units that used to be even better than they are now. Tactical 1, yeah, it's great, and they've got token sharing, which is great. So if you've got long range units early in the game with your Scout 2, you can scout on, move, and you've got 3 aims that you can share with the rest of your army. So if you have units that benefit from aims, for instance, Commandos, which we're probably going to talk about in a bit, the arcs can just buff them up, and that's still a really great utility to have. Sharpshooter 1 covers not what it used to be, but it's really useful on the larger dice pools that these guys are going to be throwing. Obviously, they do have charge, so sometimes they can just be negating the cover anyway. But sometimes shooting at that range 2 with the Sharpshooter 1 just means you probably do an extra hit or 2, right, with the dice pool. As I said, charge, like these arcs sum up a lot of what sort of efficient, good units in the game do at the moment, which is things that buff off of movement, whether that's tactical, whether that's charge, whether that's relentless, like agile, like rebel troopers. Like that was such a game changer for them. Like because you have to move so much in the game now, things that proc off movement just get so much value, and yeah, it just frees you up to do more with the rest of your turn, which is absolutely fantastic. They've even got Impervious. Like, yeah, it's pretty wild. They've got Impervious, so things that like ranged pierce or even melee pierce that would normally be pretty good against red saves, they're still good. They still have a lot of value, but you do just sort of tone it down a little bit, especially when you have the access to surges across the whole army that Gar inherently do. So yeah, while these guys don't naturally surge in inverted commas, you can normally grab a surge if you need one, and that makes them really strong. And on top of all that, they got Courage 2, which doesn't always mean they're going to be getting both their actions, but at least means they're quite likely to get one of their actions, and sometimes one of their actions is all that you're going to need. In terms of how I would spec these guys, I would probably take the Clone Commander still. It got nerfed quite severely, went up by 8 points. But you're not so much worried about the Inspire 1, you're just worried about Reliable 1. Like, getting Reliable on any unit in Gar is just super valuable. So even though it's very expensive now, it probably still is worth taking. And then just targeting scopes, because you're gonna have lots of aims, so that's how I'd run them. If you want to, you can just drop the Clone Commander and just take them vanilla, and then they're like a 64-point unit that feels really good, can be really aggressive, and has, similar to Sleep Cell, really some good high roll potential. So yeah, just a really good value unit that can sort of be a huge threat, a bit like Sleep Cell in those sort of close to mid-range battles. And finally, Clone Commandos used to be completely ridiculous, now a bit less ridiculous. I don't hate Commandos so much anymore. I think they're fine, and I think that showed in the poll. I think if we'd taken this, pre-nerf, it would have been perhaps slightly different, although all 3 of these units were nerfed, so actually it might still have been quite a similar result. But yeah, they just perform really consistently. Like, you kind of want to hold them, I think, a bit in the early game, just because they have that infiltrate. So basically you want to be infiltrating into that range 4 with their config weapon. By the way, getting that high velocity on their config weapon is pretty wild. Like, it is very strong, and it does, if rebels are going to be running around, it does negate that really well. And getting 4 red dice at range 4, very decent. They don't naturally surge, but again, you can normally grab a surge if you need one. Aside from that, they just have a bunch of really useful keywords. Like, they've got the shields, they've got the pattern armor, they've got target 1. complete the mission just makes it so that most of the time they're grabbing surges either offensively or defensively. So even if you don't have any surge tokens, they can normally be getting it anyway. Their blasters can have suppressive if you want it, or you can get impact in the config version. Yeah, they're just really solid and a good sort of backmarker unit that can also handle themselves in sort of more mid-range battles if you need them to as well. So yeah, feels really good. And at 90 points, I think they are now pretty balanced, but still very strong. Moving over to a bit of a sad one, it's Empire. They're in a rough place. And actually, looking at their 3 top units, they're all individually pretty good units, but making it all fit together in a coherent way in an army is a bit strange. And I think Empire needs a bit more of an identity, because aside from Tempest Force, it doesn't really have like a clear sort of direction. And I don't know if you can necessarily describe Tempest Force as a direction of itself. But yeah, first one we're talking about is Krennic. My goodness, 65 points is very cheap. Like, it's great value. And I think in a way that, normally Leia is worth the upgrade over the basic officer, I think Krennic is almost always, I can't, unless you're really strapped for points, worth the upgrade over the basic officer. The keywords are great, cunning, you've seen with Dooku, like, just if you really need to go first, unless they've got Han, you can guarantee going first with that 1 pip, which is fantastic, and it gives you pseudo auto control as well, so that's really nice. Compel is a great keyword. Like, again, action efficiency is huge in the current version of the game, so being able to get that extra efficiency is super nice. Exemplar is fantastic on a unit that is designed to sit at the back and generate, your aims and things like that to buff up units. Again, with his command cards, like, his 3 pip it needs to be used correctly, and when it is used correctly, it is fantastic. And you just need ways to make sure that because it affects both sides. You need to have ways to negate the effect that it'll have on your side of the army. His 2 pip's fine, and his 1 pip is interesting in terms of it kind of gives you order control ish on the card, but it doesn't give out the orders per se. So I think, especially with that cunning, it is a pretty useful 1 pip to have. He has 2 command slots, which for 65 points is great. If you're running a couple of mercs, which you can do in the operative slot if you really want to, that's fine. Or you can be taking the improv, the aggressive tactics if you want it, like things like that. I wouldn't probably take aggressive tactics on Krennic too often, but you can if you want to. But having those 2 command slots is only ever going to be a good thing. And then you can probably take the binocs in his equipment slot, just for getting that spotter too, because if you are using that action, getting 2 aims feels really good. Death Trooper synergy is useful, and definitely something that if Death Troopers were better would be super valuable, but it just doesn't quite fit together, unfortunately, at the moment. I think Death Troopers are just a bit too expensive for what you do get, so maybe we'll get better, but perhaps not the best right now. And then, the one who won the poll, and I think was always likely to win the poll, is Darth Vader. Flat Courage, it's not game-breaking, that's an exaggeration, but it's so strong. And combined with that 8 health, and he can get hold of some surges if you want them, like, it's great. And a well-played Vader just feels like this, a bit like he should, actually. And I think Vader is an example of a unit that's been designed really well. Like, he feels like this. He's quite slow, but he feels like this sort of like unstoppable juggernaut, and he just rolls through units. That saber is the best in the game. Most of the time you're doing 5 PS3, and because it's red dice, it's not unlikely to get 6 PS3. And one unit being able to do 6 PS3 in 1 attack is wild. So yeah, really good. Combined with the fact he has some of the best command cards in the game still, like, so many you can go through. His 3 pip giving him the potential to infiltrate is fantastic, or getting that reliable 2 if you want to go that way. Vader's Might is fantastic as well. Implacable, new ways to motivate, like, so many good things. Like, and he can pretty much run the show by himself if you want him to. So yeah, it's a lot for people to deal with when Vader's on the board. He is slow. I will say that. Like, his speed 1 generally off that 3-pip, you are going to want to be infiltrating in. The reliable 2 is obviously nice because he doesn't naturally surge either way, but if it saves you a turn or 2 of movement, I think infiltrating in has some huge value. He also can't jump, but because he's speed 1 anyway, doesn't hurt you to climb. So while you can't go over stuff necessarily, and it can be a bit of a pain when you're looking to burst the speed, yeah, not a huge issue, and definitely something you can work around. He also can't be suppressed, so yeah, you're always going to be getting those actions off. He has relentless, not charge, and this is good if you do find space for saber throw. Getting 3 pierce 3 off that saber with the way that cover is now is really good, and can be a really nice thing to have in your back pocket if you want it. For his force slots, I would imagine you'd be going push. I think it's not, it's not staple to his card or whatever, what the cliche is that people say, but I think if you're dropping this many points on a unit, put force push on him, and even if it gets you like 1 extra attack or something, absolutely worth it. Like, yeah, and the objective play is also a really useful option. So yeah, definitely look for force push. Burst of speed for obvious reasons. He's only speed 1, so while you won't be able to move the next turn, if you're stuck in melee with somebody, you don't need to move, so that's fine. And then I would take saber throw just for a bit of utility. You can take choke if you want to, but I would take saber throw. And then his command slot, aggressive tactics is, I've said it a few times on perhaps ones that don't merit as much, but I think aggressive tactics here makes a lot of sense. Even if it just gives him like 3 or 4 surge tokens through the course of the game, I think that's worth it, and definitely good value. And if you can spread out some orders as well and give out a few more surges, that's also great. So yeah, I think aggressive tactics here, maybe improv if you want it, but yeah, I think aggressive tactics is the take. Also, he has, I should definitely mention this because it's important, he has compel on core troopers, so getting those extra actions off with, a snow or a shore trooper or even the basic storms, absolutely great. So yeah, not a huge surprise that Vader won that one. And then my favourite Empire unit, just because they're a bit goofy and when I see them on the board it's always a fun time, is the Humble Dewback. They're 70 points. They used to be 90, they're 70 now. It's not bad. And in that support slot, I think there's a nice combo between them and the range troopers. Like maybe you take a range trooper and 2 Dewbacks or something, but they just seem to complement each other quite nicely in that slot, and they shore up each other's weaknesses, which I think is really good. I think having units in the same slot that do very different things can sometimes be quite valuable, because especially, thinking about that turn 1, you probably want to be holding like the range troopers if you can, so they can actually move onto the board and shoot something. It's unlikely the Dewbacks will get to shoot turn 1, but maybe. So chucking out those Dewbacks a bit earlier, when they're not worried about shooting and just worried about moving onto the board, and then holding that support for when the range troopers come on, could be really valuable. Their armor 1 is great, and these guys still get cover because they're creature troopers, so actually it's a bit like, getting low profile or something. Like removing damage for free is just super valuable, and armor 1 is nowhere near as good for obvious reasons as armor 2, but it is still really valuable, so definitely a good thing to have. Relentless, phenomenal. Like gives you so many options and enables some of their weapons to be usable in ways that they otherwise wouldn't be. So looking at the flamer rifle, for instance, like I don't think that would normally, like in the previous version, it just didn't make sense. But now, because it's melee and range 1, like you can just use the sort of spur and your large base to actually move up further than people might expect and get that flamer off in a way that people might not anticipate. You can take longer range options if you want. Personally, I don't think that quite makes sense. It might feel weird having a flamer and the melee weapon, 2 things that are both used quite up close and personal, but to me they do quite different things. I think the Razor Claws attack would maybe be for like a single target or a more elite unit, whereas you do having that flame rifle for those larger units can sometimes just be super valuable, and especially when you surge to hit, I think having those flamers can be really useful. In terms of how I would run them, as I've just said, I think I would probably take the flamer rifle, and then it's tenacity or it's into the fray as far as I can tell. Personally, I'd go for into the fray, just because I'm taking probably the flame rifle and not the longer range weapons. But yeah, I think either of those are fully justifiable, and nothing wrong with wanting an extra red dice on your melee attacks. I think, especially when you've got surge to hit going on. Yeah, they're just a really solid damaging unit, and I think they would complement a Vader or something really well. So a fun support slot unit that you can take. Moving over to my home territory, moving over to the Rebel faction. Going to start off with Han. He did come last in the poll, which I was a little bit surprised about, but I think I have cooled a bit on Han recently, and I think in hindsight, this might have been replaced by like Commander Luke, or my personal favourite, Op Luke. But yeah, I think Han's got a little bit worse, and I'll explain why now. But to go over his strengths first, his gun is still as good as it has ever been, and it only got better with the cover changes. 2 red Pierce 2 with 2 shots, and steady, and surge to crit, and sharpshooter 1. Like, as long as you're not shooting vehicles, this is great. And you can jump out, jump back, hide an objective. It's so good. And especially with his 0 pip, there isn't a way they can stop you doing that. So the value you can generate from even 1 round of hand shooting can be pretty phenomenal. And especially if you're shooting into red surging units, great. Like, just makes it so difficult for them to deal with. As I said, this steady strat, the steady jump in, jump out strat is really good, and given the range at which Legion is played now, I think that's why Han has become sort of stronger, as it were, because it's no longer so much. There are elements of long range still, for sure, and I think there always will be, but Han excels in those mid to sort of short range duels that we see so often in Legion now. He is more survivable than you might expect. His like low profile is solid. Like, most of the time it's kind of like Nimble. They're not the same. I think Nimble is better, but I think it's close. So yeah, just taking off a hit for free is always going to be nice. And then Uncanny Luck 3. Rerolling a white defense die is better than just a normal red defense die. The maths will back me up if you go a little bit maths, but yeah. So as long as you're being hit by a fairly small dice pool, it's not too bad. But something about those white defense die, they just don't quite seem to obey the rules in the way that the red defense die do. So yeah, while it is a useful keyword to have, don't rely on it to keep you alive. His command cards have always been good, and they continue to be good. As I've said, the 0 pip, in the same way, like a Dooku 1 pip with cunning, or a Krennic 1 pip with cunning. If you want to guarantee to go first, it's great, and that is always going to be super valuable, especially when you can have a seize the initiative on a Luke or a Bad Batch, or you can't seize with Bad Batch, but on a Din or something, for instance, to guarantee that go first. It can be super valuable. His 3 pip also, if you know a big command card's coming, you can just play that out and then discard and move on. And now that you need 1 command card less, it's even more valuable than it used to be. So yeah, that's great. And no longer means you have to play a command card down all game, especially when most of the time you're playing standing orders turn 1. So yeah, just buys you a lot of time, which is great. He is relatively cheap. He's not cheap, but he is relatively cheap. The way I run him, it'll tend to come in around 113. That's quite specific, actually, but 113-ish points. And yeah, his melee is phenomenal. Moving on. In terms of how I'd kit him, I would, if you need 2 mercs, take Underworld. If you don't need 2 mercs, take Improv and Up Close and Personal, because I think it's great. There is an argument for Recon Intel. I don't think it's a great one, but I can understand why you would want to do that, because that speed 1 on and then speed 2 can give you some really good threat range. And I think if it was still 5 points, it would be a bit more of a conversation, but I think at 8 points, it feels a bit rough. Moving on to the best unit in the entire game. Maybe. They're great. They are so scary to deal with, and 12 searching black dice, with their access to aims, it's very, very strong. I think they're the scariest turn 1 unit in the game with that Scout 2. And if you misplay, they can insta-kill a lot of things. Like with 2 aims, I think their dice pool averages 11 hits, and there's a couple of crits in there as well, so you can't even necessarily rely on cover saving you that much. So it is scary, and they pack such a punch for 75 points, which is mostly how you're going to be running them. Always take the Astro, unless you, I don't even know, like, cut something else, put the Astro in, is the only way I'd say to run this. Like, there is too much synergy with Sleeper Cell and the Astro. Like, they're going to be shot. Like, if your opponent can get to them and can shoot them, absolutely it's going to be happening. So getting those dodges, being in heavy cover, absolutely make it happen. Get the Astro on these guys. Courage 2 as well. Like, you want 2 actions ideally because you want to move and shoot, but it's very difficult to panic them. So it does make them good objective holders. And like, even if they don't have an aim, like they're still dealing like 8-ish hits without an aim, which is still really scary. So yeah, it's really solid combination to have that courage too. Yeah, and they do just draw so much fire. Like, people really hate these guys. It's a bit like, when he's like arcs on the board or an ATRT flamer or something, like it's gonna get targeted down. In terms of how I'd run them, Astro 100%. Yeah, fine points for the Astro. Take stuff away from the rest of your army to get the Astro on these guys. And targeting scopes, if you've got the points left, is always nice. Like, most of the time, you're probably going to be using like 2 or 3 aims if you're lucky with these guys. So getting an extra 3-ish black dice can be really nice and probably is worth that 4-point upgrade. So yeah, those would be the options if you can find them. And finally, the humble or not so humble ATRT. It's great. It's a really good unit to have. It is the Droideka of the Rebel faction. In a faction that badly needs a Droideka type unit, it needs a unit that you can just leave to do its own thing, and it will generate value, and it will make your opponent's game more challenging. Personally, I would always take the laser cannon. I think flamers are a great aspiration to have, and that's great, but you're not going to flame anything. And if you're happy with your ATRT just drawing fire, that's great. But yeah, not perhaps an optimal use for these guys. But if you just want 3 units to sit near a back objective and fire a combined, what would that be? 3 red, 6 black with impact 9 every turn and surge to crit up for 180 points, I think it's great. And on top of that, you get 3 acts out of that, and they're all LOS blocking. It's fantastic. And with the laser cannon, they're 60 points. So like, every action your opponent uses to kill them just feels so bad. And you do have to commit to kill these guys. Like, you either need a really big dice pool or you need some nice keywords to be getting through. Like, Force users most of the time won't one-hit these in melee. Like, either unless it's a brutal Vader high roll, which I don't think it is feasible. Like, most Force users won't be able to one-hit these guys, and that's great. And it also helps that support isn't that competitive for the Rebel faction. Like, these guys are going against Tauns, which are too expensive, swoops, which are nearly unusable at the moment. Like, I don't really see how that would fit together. And the laser cannon thing, the one with the huge base, that, yeah, just completely obnoxious. I do own it, but never painted it because I just don't see myself using it in an army. Yeah, it's great, and you can trade so efficiently into especially enemy armor. In the world in which I think Aquas are going to be as good as they are, these guys feel really good shooting at Aquas. Most of the time you're doing either 2 or 3, and you can just basically ignore their armor because of that impact 3 from the laser cannon. So yeah, it feels really good. And if you do want to run, the rotary blaster or the flamer, absolutely fire away. But I think for a really solid value proposition, I think an ATRT with a laser cannon is great. And finally, last and unfortunately very much least at the moment, yeah, I won't have a rant here about why AMG is doing what they've done to Shadow Collective. I fundamentally don't understand it and really disagree. I think Shadow Collective had a really good space in the game, and I think it offered something that none of the other factions do, and I thought that was really healthy. But it's their game, and they can choose to do what they want. It was really nice to see. Was it I think it was Las Vegas Open or something? There was some Shadow Collective lists running around, and that was really good because I never really hated Shadow Collective. Like the Shadow Collective bus combination was pretty tough to deal with, but yeah, a bit sad to see where they are in the current game. But anyway, short rant over. In terms of their best units, got the BSEs. These guys still do what they've always done, and I think they do it really well. The problem is it's now harder for them to do what they've always done because other units now do it a bit better, and crucially, they do it for a lot cheaper. They have a really solid range 2 dice pool, and they've got good access to aims, and they've got precise. That's great. Like, in terms of their damage output, still really strong. Their independent aim 1 is really good in terms of their synergy. Like, it's exactly the independent you'd want to go with these guys. They have some great heavy weapon options. The mag det isn't as good as it used to be because cover isn't what it used to be, but it's still a decent budget option. But I would probably take the scattergun now just for that range 2 shot. And then you probably want to be taking the Black Sun Vigo. Black Sun Vigo, just for that independent surge, because these guys don't naturally surge, and being able to put a surge on a unit with a big dice pool or with red saves is super valuable. The basic unit is fairly cheap, like 50 points is okay, but as soon as you start to shut the weapons on, they normally end up around 100 points, seems to be the rule of thumb. They have good bus synergy, like the unorthodox tactician giving these guys more aims is great, and yeah, it's not obviously as good as it used to be, but there is some good natural synergy there with the bus. And Dauntless, the Black Sun Vigo gets them to Courage 2, and with Dauntless, it is quite hard to actually suppress these guys, so quite a nice combination. But yeah, if Shadow Collective was better, these guys would be better, but unfortunately, I don't think they're good enough anymore to like carry the faction, as it were. But they still definitely have some good utility. I should note here, like, I'm not pretending to be an expert in Shadow Collective. These were just the units I thought would be the most powerful, and chucked them out on the poll, and these were the results that came in. Gar Saxon seems to be quite decent. I've played against him a few times, and while he unfortunately does end up being a bit more pricey than I had expected once you chuck all his upgrades on, he does feel like a pretty decent unit, and with his command cards as well, he can definitely offer something to the faction. Anything with Mando saves and speed 3 can be a good objective player now, like especially later on in the game when maybe your opponents used all their big power stuff. It's actually very difficult to kill a Mando if you're not focusing them down. He also has some good options, like he has his long range sniper, he has the flamer, he's got some rockets. Like, he can kind of do a little bit of whatever you need him to. He can't do it all exceptionally well, but he can kind of do all of what you need him to do. Compel, again, as I said before, it's a great keyword to have, especially on Mandos for just the max efficiency there. Getting an extra move out of them can be super valuable. Rather, you could do a move and a shoot rather than maybe just a move or just a shoot, which is hugely valuable on an expensive unit. His command cards are decent. They tend to buff units kind of like close to him or other units like him, so the special forces. His 1-pip's actually quite nice, like that number of tokens, and like if you are planning to focus down a target anyway, it can be super valuable. So yeah, that's quite a nice thing to have in your pocket. And yeah, there's not much competition in Shadow Collective in the commander slot, so that kind of helps. But yeah, it's rough. I feel bad for Shadow Collective, man. And then finally, Bossk. I was kind of tempted to stick him in maybe a couple of the other factions. Like, I think there's an argument that he's maybe a top 3 unit in Empire. That's a discussion for another day. But I love Bossk. Like, I think he just has such a clear role, and he does that role really consistently and actually pretty well. Like his gun is great, like range 4, surge to crit. You put targeting scopes on him, and you just sit back and you just plink, 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 plink. And thanks to that pierce and that suppressive, anything you hit is going to get either slowed down or is going to actually probably die if it doesn't just get suppressed. His command cards synergize with that really well, aside from his one pip, which is just bizarre. Like, I guess the theme is kind of there, but in terms of the way he plays, it makes no sense. But yeah, his 2 pip and his 3 pip are great. Like, giving him some aims with the ability to attack again, always going to be super valuable. And he doesn't need orders, so even though his independent is garbage, like, if he had independent aim 1, then we would be talking. But when he already surges to crit, like, yes, okay, he's getting some defensive surges, but you're kind of hoping he's not going to be shot anyway, so whatever. Another thing, his melee's no joke. Like, it averages, what is that, just over 3 hits, I think, or just under 3 hits, sorry, and it's got PS1, and like, you know, within rage and stuff like that, like, he can be pretty decent in melee. You don't want him to be in melee, but if push comes to shove and he needs to, it's definitely an option that he has. Yeah, he's just a really effective unit that does its role well and doesn't need much support. So I think while he won't be something you build a list around necessarily, like, if you need something in your army that maybe does something a bit different, I think it's definitely a worthwhile inclusion. In terms of how I'd run him, I would just stick targeting scopes on him and call it a day. 109 points, absolutely fine. So yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. As I say, I would really only describe myself as someone who is very experienced with Rebels. I've played obviously against all the different factions to varying extents, and I think I've done my best to explain why I think each of these units are the best in their faction. But if you disagree, absolutely chuck it in the comments below. Be very interested to hear what people have to say, and like, if there's different metas and like that makes different units weaker or stronger, also stick that down below. Really interested to hear how all of that fits together. But yeah, drop a like, drop a subscribe, and we'll see you for the next one.